dollar is getting mightier for some very frightful rationales, purporting frightful in provisions of the macroeconomy. What's what likely is situated ahead, what is likely informative us. But this is a puzzle for many citizens because they observe it in the U.S. Objectively, okay, our liability to GDP ratio is over 130%, a peak in the U.S. Recital. Heaps of analysis originating from, evidently Ken Rogoff, but genuinely Carmen Reinhart, Vincent Reinhart, and others, but numerous others, not just them, that remarks at that liability to GDP ratios. You can't bloom. You can perhaps refinance and muddle through, but it forever finishes either in default, which is doubtful because we can print the money that much is precise, or utmost inflation where here's your $1 trillion back. Choice fortune procuring a loaf of bread, so we'll see how that depicts out. But the way it is depicting out in genuine time is that the U.S. budgetary growth is tremendously weak. So we've got high atmosphere, high liability to GDP ratio. Populist talk joblessness sealed to an all-interval low. Yeah, but even at 3.5% or so, that is tremendously low. I signify that I retreat to the 1960s, and that was low by the gauges of the 1960s. But that wholly ignores likely 8 to 10 million Americans who were flawlessly able of having jobs and functioning primates 25 to 54 years old who are not in the workforce. That gauge is picked up in drudgery force contribution rate, which is low. That peaked around 70% in 2000, up from the 1970s, and that was women's future in the workforce and other influences. But now it's down to around 62% and change. It ticked up a little in the last report, but it's still tremendously low. It's never 100. I signify you could be a homemaker, a pupil. They're retired, early retirees. There are many rationales populace isn't in the workforce, but not taking 10% off or 14% decline from the onset place in over 20 years. So if you toss those citizens into, they're not called jobless because they're not gazing for jobs. But if you toss them in, joblessness would be closer to 10%, which is a recession or depression level, genuinely. And I could go on, but the spot is, there are all kinds of signs of weakness. If we have the deficit is out of steer, and your J deficit is out of steer. So what's not to like? You observe all that, you remark, what? Are you kidding me? I signify, get me out of the dollar. Get me go get anything else. Why is the dollar so strong? And the retort is for this. You have to go late the curtain. You have to observe what's called the plumbing of the international budgetary system. And I had a discussion, and this goes back. This is 1980, so I'm a youngster, up in future vice chairman of Citibank. That's back in the days when it was a bank before they turned it into a hedge fund. I'm like a 27 or whatever, a 28, maybe an ancient lawyer. But I'm talking to Walter Wriston. It's a one-on-one dialogue for those who don't know the name or don't recall. He was likely the second greatest banker of the 20th century after Pierpont Morgan. So I'll give Morgan the prize. But he left around 1910 and Wriston was the inventor of the euro dollar. 2. The negotiable certificate of deposit eurodollars are around a little earlier, but he took the CD that was your interest in the eurodollar and made them negotiable and tradable. So I'm having a dialogue with him, and I had just seen this movie. It's called Rollover, and it's again 1980. It's basically about the collapse of confidence in the US dollar. And basically the idea was, remember this is during the Arab oil embargoes, and the Iranian oil embargo and price of oil quadrupled in 8 years and all that. So the theme was the Arabs are taking the money out of the banking system and buying gold, and they're stashing the gold away, and this is the collapse of the financial system. That was sort of the plot. So I said, Mr. Wriston, what about that? Everyone took their money out of the system and bought gold. Wouldn't that collapse the system? And he looked at me like I was a new kid on the block, which I was. And he said, well, what you have to understand is that you can take your money out of the bank and you can buy gold. But the person who sold you the gold got the money and they put it back in the bank. So it doesn't go anywhere. It's a closed circuit. And of course now I'm like, oh yeah, you're right. Of course he's right. And he said, so the stability of the system doesn't depend on who sells what for dollars. Yeah, it affects exchange rates a little bit and interest rates for the price of gold. But he said the money always, it can't literally disappear. It has to go back into the system. It's a closed circuit. And of course, that's how the euro-dollar system works. But it presupposes that you can always borrow in the euro-dollar market. In other words, that closed circuit analogy is correct provided the big banks are willing to lend to each other. So, if UPS was selling the gold into the Arabs and they got the money and they put it back in Citibank Nassau, it's all good. But what happens if that money supply, now I'm talking about euro dollars, actually shrank? And that is a heart attack in the global financial system. So now we're like, well, okay, what's going on? And believe it or not, there's a global dollar shortage. And when you say that, people say, wait a second, you kidding me? The Fed printed the Fed's balance sheet in 2008. At the start of the global financial crisis was $800 billion. It was $4.5 trillion by the time we got to the end of the taper in November 2014. Then, okay, yelling a little bit, but mostly Powell got it. They started quantitative tightening. They got it back down to around $3.5 trillion by the time COVID came along. And then boom,